Take a breath and slow everything down for a moment. Before you try to understand this message logically, let yourself feel it. Sometimes the heart recognizes something long before the mind is ready to explain it. Perhaps that is why these words found their way to you now. Maybe this is not simply another video appearing in front of you at random. Maybe it is meeting you at a moment when something inside you has been quietly asking for an answer. You have carried more than you let people see. You learned how to keep functioning even when you were emotionally drained. You continued with your responsibilities, smiled when necessary, and told yourself that you had moved on. Yet whenever the noise disappeared and you were left alone with your thoughts, the same person somehow returned to your mind. You may have convinced yourself that you accepted what happened. You may even believe that you no longer need an explanation. But somewhere beneath that acceptance, unanswered questions remain. Why did they leave the way they did? Why did they become distant? Why did their behavior change? And most importantly, did they ever truly stop feeling something for you? This message is not here to drag you backward. It is not asking you to reopen wounds that took so much time to heal. It is not telling you to abandon reality or build your life around someone who is no longer present. Instead, consider this an opportunity to look at the situation from another angle, to understand something that may have remained hidden beneath the silence. The person you've been thinking about became involved with someone else. That fact may still be painful, and there is no reason to pretend otherwise. But what happened internally for them may have been far more complicated than what you were able to see from the outside. If they could remove their fear, pride, defensiveness, and all the explanations they used to protect themselves, what would they actually say? Perhaps their answer would be very different from the story their actions seem to tell. So before going any further, take one slow breath. Let your shoulders loosen. Give yourself permission to be present for a moment. You don't have to believe every word you hear. Simply listen, reflect, and take whatever helps you understand your own experience more clearly. There is a reason this particular person may have been occupying your thoughts lately. Their memory might surface while you're working, resting, talking to someone, or doing something completely unrelated. And sometimes what follows isn't a single emotion. It is a strange mixture of sadness, curiosity, hope, disappointment, and longing that you cannot easily put into words. But this isn't an invitation to create fantasies. It isn't asking you to wait for someone who has chosen to be absent. And it certainly isn't telling you to ignore what actually happened. The purpose is clarity. Because the reality remains. They became emotionally or romantically connected with another person. That happened. Denying it would only keep you trapped in the same cycle. Yet accepting the event doesn't necessarily mean you understand the reasons behind it. From the outside, their choices may have looked simple. They pulled away. They became distant. They chose another direction. Perhaps they appeared completely certain about what they were doing. But internally, things may not have been nearly that simple. There were emotions they didn't know how to process. There were fears they couldn't comfortably admit. There were feelings they pushed underneath layers of distraction and avoidance because confronting them directly felt too difficult. Instead of sitting with those emotions, they tried to outrun them. They may have told themselves that leaving would make everything easier. Maybe they believed that enough distance would eventually erase the attachment. Perhaps they thought a new relationship could give them the fresh beginning they believed they needed. But changing circumstances does not automatically change what someone carries inside, and you may have sensed that something was wrong long before you had any proof. Your intuition may have noticed the difference in their behavior. Their words might have said everything was fine, yet something in their presence felt disconnected. Their smile didn't always reach the emotional place you remembered. Their responses became different. Conversations that once felt natural started feeling forced. You probably noticed the pauses, the delayed replies, the sudden emotional distance. The moments when they seemed present physically, but somewhere else mentally. Perhaps they began giving shorter answers, avoiding deeper conversations, or building invisible boundaries between you without ever explaining why. Individually, none of these moments seemed important enough to provide an answer. But when you placed them together, they created a pattern your heart could feel even when your mind couldn't explain it. And perhaps the most painful question was this: Did they simply stop caring about me? That question can stay with someone for a very long time. But sometimes the truth is more complicated than indifference. They may not have walked away because every feeling disappeared. They may have walked away because what they were feeling became too difficult for them to handle. There is a difference. When someone has difficulty sitting with emotional vulnerability, escape can feel easier than honesty. Distance can feel safer than intimacy. Avoidance can temporarily feel more manageable than having a conversation that forces someone to confront their deepest emotions. That explanation doesn't erase what happened to you. It doesn't make the silence acceptable. It doesn't undo the confusion they created, and it doesn't mean you should excuse behavior that hurt you. Understanding someone's internal struggle is not the same thing as approving of their choices. Your pain still matters. Your disappointment still matters. The unanswered questions still matter. But perhaps they were dealing with an internal conflict you could never fully see. They may have been afraid of what the connection required from them. They may have felt overwhelmed by emotions they didn't have the language or courage to express. So instead of saying, "I'm scared," they created distance. Instead of saying, "I don't know what I'm feeling," they acted certain. Instead of admitting, "This connection affects me more than I expected," they attempted to shut it down. They may have believed that separation would finally bring peace. But emotions don't always disappear simply because someone refuses to acknowledge them. You can change the environment. You can start another relationship. You can fill your schedule with distractions. You can convince yourself that you've made the right decision. Yet unresolved emotions have a way of resurfacing. Because running from an emotion doesn't resolve it. It only postpones the moment when you have to face it. That may be what is beginning to happen now. The connection may have changed, but the emotional imprint didn't necessarily vanish with it. Some people leave your life physically while still carrying the psychological impact of what they experienced with you, and eventually the distractions become quieter. The newness fades. The mind becomes less occupied. And in those quieter moments, the feelings that were buried begin asking to be acknowledged. This is where their involvement with someone else becomes important to understand correctly. It may have looked like they found your replacement. It may have felt as though another person received everything you once hoped to receive. But perhaps that wasn't the real story. Perhaps they weren't searching for someone better. Perhaps they were searching for an easier emotional experience. They may have believed that choosing another path would finally silence the memories, attachment, and unfinished emotions connected to you. They may have hoped that a different relationship would make the past irrelevant. But you cannot always escape an emotional truth by changing the person standing beside you. A new relationship can change circumstances, but it cannot automatically erase unresolved feelings. And this may be the realization they are slowly coming to terms with. You were not necessarily replaced. What they attempted to replace was the discomfort of facing what they truly felt. They didn't necessarily find a way to erase the connection. They found a way to postpone confronting it, and sometimes postponement can last for months or even years, but eventually what remains unresolved asks to be understood. That doesn't mean you should stop living your life. It doesn't mean you should wait. It doesn't mean their realization guarantees a return. It simply means that what happened may have contained more emotional complexity than their outward behavior revealed. And perhaps the most important thing for you now is not whether they eventually admit this truth. It is whether you are finally willing to release yourself from the need for them to explain it. Because your healing cannot depend entirely on another person's courage to tell you what they were unable to say before. Sometimes clarity comes when you stop demanding answers from someone who couldn't provide them and begin trusting what their actions already taught you. You can understand their struggle without carrying it. You can acknowledge the connection without remaining trapped inside it, and you can accept that something mattered deeply without needing it to return in the same form. That is where your power begins, not in waiting for their confession, not in decoding every silence, but in choosing peace even when some questions remain unanswered. They thought postponing their feelings would eventually make them disappear. They assumed that enough time, enough distance, and enough distraction would weaken whatever emotional connection still existed between you. But instead of resolving anything, they simply pushed the problem further into the future. The emotions they tried to escape didn't vanish. They waited. And eventually they reached a point where pretending became harder than admitting the truth. Understanding their decision may never completely remove the hurt you experienced, but it can help explain something that once seemed impossible to understand. Their choice of another person was not necessarily evidence that someone else created a deeper bond with them. In many ways, their decision was driven by fear. Fear of being emotionally exposed. Fear of allowing another person to see behind the carefully protected version of themselves. And fear of discovering that a genuine connection comes with responsibilities they weren't prepared to carry. What existed between you reached a part of them that wasn't familiar or comfortable. It demanded more than surface-level affection. It challenged them to look inward, question their defenses, and become honest about emotions they had spent years avoiding. That kind of connection can be frightening for someone who hasn't learned how to sit comfortably with vulnerability. Instead of moving towards something meaningful, they moved towards something easier to control. The relationship they chose may have felt safer because it required less emotional risk. It didn't force them to confront their deepest insecurities. It didn't demand that they reveal the parts of themselves they preferred to keep hidden. From the outside, that choice could have looked like peace, predictability, comfort, stability. But there is an important difference between feeling comfortable and feeling fulfilled. A relationship can be easy to maintain while still leaving important emotional needs untouched, and avoiding depth does not automatically create happiness. Even after they tried to continue with their life, reminders of you kept appearing in places they didn't expect. Something as ordinary as a familiar expression, a particular laugh, a conversation about something you once discussed, or even a quiet moment alone could bring the memory of you back. They didn't have to intentionally think about you. Sometimes the smallest things did it for them, and silence became especially revealing. When there was nothing left to distract them, emotions that had been buried beneath daily activity began rising again. Without consciously deciding to do it, they started comparing experiences. They may not have wanted to compare you with anyone else, but meaningful emotional connections leave impressions. They become part of how a person understands intimacy, communication, trust, and emotional safety. And the more they noticed those differences, the harder it became to deny what they had lost. They began realizing that what existed between you wasn't something they could simply reproduce by finding another person. Every relationship has its own emotional language. Every connection creates its own atmosphere. Some bonds remain psychologically significant long after people stop speaking. Eventually, they understood that what existed between you carried something they couldn't find through convenience alone. There had been a particular depth to the way you understood one another. There had been moments of honesty and emotional recognition that couldn't simply be duplicated because they had chosen to walk away. But that realization came late, perhaps much later than it should have. By the time they understood the value of what they had, some doors had already closed. Conversations that could have happened never happened. Explanations that could have prevented confusion were never given. Opportunities to handle things differently had already passed. And now another emotion has begun following them quietly: guilt. It may not be obvious to anyone watching from the outside. They may never talk about it openly. They may continue behaving as though everything is normal. But guilt often becomes loudest when the world becomes quiet. At the end of the day, when responsibilities are finished and distractions become less effective, memories can become much harder to suppress. They may replay conversations they once dismissed. They may remember moments they didn't appreciate until they were gone. They may hear your words differently now because time has changed the way they understand them. Things that once seemed insignificant can suddenly carry an entirely different meaning. And beneath all of that may be the realization that they left without giving you the explanation you deserved. They may regret choosing comfort over honesty. They may regret allowing you to believe that you simply weren't important enough. They may regret hurting someone whose intentions toward them were genuine. With time, they may also recognize the confusion their silence created. You were left to interpret behavior they refused to explain. You had to create your own answers because they wouldn't provide them. You had to wonder whether the connection meant anything at all because they never had the courage to tell you what was actually happening inside them. And perhaps now they understand something they failed to understand back then. You weren't demanding perfection. You weren't asking them to have every answer. You were asking for something much simpler: honesty, consistency, clarity, truth. That realization can become surprisingly heavy because it forces someone to acknowledge that the situation didn't necessarily require perfection, it required courage. Yet this guilt may remain hidden. They don't have to cry in front of others or openly confess regret for it to exist. Sometimes guilt hides behind an unusually busy life. It hides behind constant entertainment, social activity, forced laughter, work, routines, and anything else that prevents a person from sitting alone with their thoughts. From the outside, they may look completely unaffected, but appearances don't always reveal what someone experiences privately. They may know that certain decisions still have consequences. They may understand that some choices cannot simply be undone because enough time has passed. And the more they tried to outrun their emotions, the more obvious the problem became. Keeping busy didn't resolve anything. Distance didn't erase anything. A new relationship didn't automatically complete the unfinished emotional story inside them, because the human mind has a strange relationship with buried emotions. What we refuse to process doesn't necessarily disappear. Sometimes it remains underneath the surface until circumstances become quiet enough for us to notice it again. Eventually, ignored emotions demand attention. And that may be the stage they are entering now. The feelings they worked so hard to suppress didn't become meaningless with time. In some cases, the absence of acknowledgement allowed those feelings to become even more significant. Every emotion they refused to confront remained somewhere beneath the surface, waiting, growing, becoming harder to explain away. Avoidance did not destroy the connection they were trying to forget. It simply delayed the moment when they would have to understand it. You may have spent countless nights asking yourself the same questions. Why didn't they just tell me? If they felt something, why did they remain silent? Why did they leave me to interpret everything on my own? Why couldn't they simply explain what was happening? Perhaps the answer was never that you meant nothing to them. Perhaps they were frightened by what honesty would require from them. And the fear wasn't necessarily about you, it was about confronting themselves. They knew that if they finally spoke without defenses, they might lose control of the carefully constructed emotional distance they had maintained for so long. The walls would begin to weaken. Feelings they had buried would become impossible to ignore. And they weren't sure they were emotionally prepared for everything that honesty might bring with it. There was also another fear, the fear of making commitments they weren't ready to honor. Because genuine honesty changes the situation. Once someone admits what they truly feel, they can no longer comfortably pretend that nothing has changed. Truth creates responsibility. Vulnerability creates accountability, and for someone who isn't emotionally prepared, that can feel overwhelming. So they chose silence. But there was another reason speaking honestly may have felt especially difficult with you. You seemed to notice what they tried to conceal. You didn't always need an explanation to recognize that something had changed. You could sense hesitation behind confident words. You could notice when their behavior didn't match what they were saying. You saw the emotional tension they attempted to hide, and that made them uncomfortable. Because they knew that with you, maintaining the mask forever would be difficult. You had a way of seeing beneath the surface. If they allowed themselves to become completely honest, the emotional distance they had relied upon could no longer protect them. They would have to face themselves. They would have to take responsibility for their choices. They would have to stop hiding behind uncertainty, and they would have to meet the relationship with authenticity instead of avoidance. At that stage of their life, they didn't believe they had the courage or emotional readiness to do that. So they remained silent. They stepped back. They allowed distance to speak where they couldn't. But silence is never truly without consequences. What isn't said still affects people. What isn't explained still creates questions. And what is avoided today often returns tomorrow in a form that becomes much harder to ignore. Perhaps that is the lesson they are finally beginning to understand. Every unanswered question created more confusion, and every unfinished conversation added another layer of distance. Eventually, they realized that avoiding difficult emotions never made them disappear. It only postponed the moment when those emotions would demand attention. Something inside them has recently changed. From the outside, their life may look normal, but internally they feel an emptiness they can no longer explain away. In that quiet space, thoughts of you have returned, not simply as memories, but as a realization of what the connection truly meant. They are beginning to understand that what existed between you wasn't something unhealthy they needed to escape. It was genuine emotional connection, and they mistook its depth for danger because it required vulnerability. If they could speak honestly now, they might admit that choosing someone else was an attempt to make life easier. They believed distance would bring peace, but instead it left an emptiness they couldn't fill. They know their silence hurt you, and they understand now that you deserved honesty instead of uncertainty. But something has changed within you too. You are no longer waiting with the same desperation. You're slowly reclaiming yourself, your peace, and your sense of worth. The questions that once consumed you don't control you in the same way anymore. You're beginning to understand that another person's choices never determined your value, and they may sense that change. For the first time, losing you completely may feel real to them. They may look back and question why they ran from something genuine, why they confused vulnerability with danger, and why they believed silence could protect anyone. Perhaps losing the connection became the lesson that forced them to confront themselves. But this message isn't asking you to wait for them. It's asking you to understand that their inability to handle the connection was about their emotional limitations, not your worth. You showed up sincerely. You cared deeply. You were willing to be vulnerable when they weren't. That isn't weakness. It is courage. If they ever return, you won't be the same person they left behind. You will judge their actions, not simply their words. You'll look for consistency, accountability, genuine change, and emotional maturity. And if they never return, your life still moves forward. Your happiness was never meant to depend on one person's decision to stay. Real closure doesn't always come through an apology or an explanation. Sometimes it arrives when you stop blaming yourself and finally stop asking whether you were enough. You were. Your value existed before this connection, throughout it, and after it. So keep choosing yourself. Protect your peace. Maintain your boundaries. Trust what you've learned. The love you gave sincerely was never a flaw. It was proof of your capacity to care deeply. If life brings them back, meet that moment with clarity rather than desperation. And if it doesn't, remember that one chapter ending does not mean your story is over. Your growth belongs to you. Your healing belongs to you. And the future still holds possibilities you cannot see yet. Thank you for being here with Jungian Horizons. If this message resonated with you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more reflections on emotional healing, self-discovery, and personal growth. Take care of yourself, trust your journey, and never forget the value you already carry within you.